How do you feel about conflict? Have you ever made a decision in the heat of the moment and then had someone else tell you that they think what you did was wrong? How did that make you feel? The year was 1942. World War II had been raging for almost 3 years. Early in July that year, a big convoy of Allied ships was sailing in the Arctic seas near the ice fields, carrying materials of war for the Soviet Union. At that time of the year, there was no nightfall. It was light all the time, travelling in a great wide ocean, approaching the most dangerous part of the voyage. The Allied sailors must have felt isolated and vulnerable. They knew that the German fleet was anchored nearby, including the most powerful warship afloat, the Tirpitz. Under the sea were Hitler's submarines, always watching and waiting. The Allied ships were on a course that took them within easy range of German bombers flying from Banach. Imagine being in a space as wide as the Arctic Ocean, let alone having to carry on operating your ships just as normal, knowing that the enemy fleet and the enemy aeroplanes would blow you to pieces if you gave them the slightest chance. The convoy was slow, but it was guarded by 3 segments of the Royal Navy, the escort captained by a man called Commander Broom. A climax came on the 4th of July. Word got round that the Germans had spotted the convoy and were going to bomb it. Many of the sailors wanted to divert the convoy out of range of the German bombers, moving in the wrong direction, but keeping themselves from harm. Captain Broom stood firm. He ordered the boats to keep moving towards their goal. Keep moving. The escort beat off the air attack, for now. But now that the Germans knew where the convoy was, it couldn't be long before another attack came. Imagine yourself on one of those boats. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, not even nighttime to conceal you. At that time, the Admiralty sent out 3 urgent messages. Secret, most immediate, cruiser force to withdraw at high speed. Then, the Admiralty said, secret, immediate. Owing to threat from surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. And then, straight after that one, secret, most immediate, convoy is to scatter. Now the last 2 messages came together, all jumbled up. They could mean only one thing. The Germans were about to attack. Tirpitz must have left the harbour. There was nothing for it but for the unarmed transport boats to gear up their engines and make a desperate dash for it, leaving the escort to form up, ready to take on the Germans when they came. Now, many years after the events of the convoy, a man named David Irving decided that he was going to write an authentic account of what happened next in the story. Now, David Irving hadn't been present in the convoy. I think he'd actually been about 5 years old at the time that the events happened. But He did lots of research and he found a publisher for his book. Once most of the drafts were prepared, Mr. Irving showed them to Captain Broom, who you all remember was the commander of the escort. Now, Captain Broom was not very happy with this at all. He felt that they made him look like a coward and a villain, and worse still, responsible for what happened next to the convoy. David Irving and his publishers changed some of the drafts, but then they went ahead and published the book in the face of Captain Broom's concerns. But what was the fate of the convoy itself in the story that I've begun? Well, I'll tell you. But just before I do, I'll say that I film these videos for interest, not for publicity and not for profit. If you're enjoying hearing about history or law, or a combination of both perhaps, then please click the subscribe button. It's absolutely free. It tells YouTube that people are finding my videos interesting, so it pushes them higher up on other people's lists, and it also gives me a big boost of confidence to know that people are watching and enjoying. Anyway, what happened next to Convoy PQ-17? Well, this. The scattered ships carrying the precious cargo made their way alone without an escort across the seas. The escort, all lined up in battle formation, ready and waiting for the German fleet to come and attack, lay idle. The attack they were waiting for never came. It turned out the Tirpitz had never actually left its moorings at all. The information from the Admiralty had been false. Chugging its way across the vast expanse of seas, each merchant ship tried to find its way to safe ports. And slowly, one by one, more than half of the vessels were picked off by German bombers and German submarines. Without their escort, the men on those boats were helpless. The plans of the British Navy, the preparations before putting to sea, the journey up to that point were all in vain for those sailors. It was an absolute tragedy. Now, the British Admiralty told Captain Broom that the disaster was not his fault. He had acted perfectly reasonably based on the information that had been given to him, and there was nothing he could have been expected to do other than what he did in that situation. The Admiralty admitted that they had made an error. But regardless of the fault, dozens of men died in the Arctic seas that day. Now, Captain Broom quite probably felt guilty about the disaster. You know how you feel when someone tells you that something wasn't your fault, but you can't help thinking, if only I'd just done it differently that day, in hindsight, I could have solved that problem. It must be 10 million times worse when lives are at stake. With all this hanging over him, you can imagine how Captain Broom must have felt when, many years later, still thinking about the incident, he received the drafts naming him as the villain of the piece in David Irving's book, and the cause for so much sorrow to the sailors and the families of the people who died. Imagine that I call you a liar, and it's not true. This is called slander. Now imagine that I write it down, or put it into another permanent form, such as a YouTube video. The lie does not just exist at the time that I say it, but it also carries on potentially, who knows, hours after I've said it, maybe weeks after I've said it, maybe months after I've said it. It might even carry on after I'm dead, which might be sooner than I imagine if I make a habit of slandering people. The permanent version of slander is called libel, and it's more serious simply because its effects can be felt for longer. Now, Captain Broom sued Cassels, the publishing house, and David Irving, the author, for libel, saying that the book that had been written and published was doing Captain Broom's reputation serious damage, and it would carry on doing serious damage for as long as that book was in circulation. The court agreed with Captain Broom. I won't go into all of the facts of the case, but I will say that the court awarded 2 different remedies. The first was compensation for the damage done to Captain Broom and his reputation. The second was a thing that is called punitive or exemplary damages. Now, the first, the compensation, says to Captain Broom, there, my man, you have been done a wrong, haven't you? Let's try and put you back into a way that makes you feel better, as if the wrong had never been done to you, as much as giving you money can ever do that. The second is to say to the publishing house and the author, well, we know that when you wrote and published this book, you expected to be sued for libel. You knew that you were sailing close to the wind, if I can use that kind of pun here, by writing this book and making the accusations that you did. You expected to be able to profit from the book, even in light of those accusations being found out, and even if you were sued for them. We won't have that. We'll make sure you can't profit from your wrongdoing. Crime, or technically in this case, tort, does not pay. Now, the second of these remedies, punitive or exemplary damages, is quite controversial in English law. And the reason for that is that civil courts, that's the courts that decide a dispute between 2 private parties, generally don't like to punish one party or the other. What they try to do is just to put everybody back how they were before the wrong was committed. Punitive or exemplary damages go further than just putting the parties back to how they were. Captain Broom had already been compensated for the wrong done to him. He was already, as far as money could do it, in the position that he would have been if the book had never been published. But on top of the compensation, the court wanted to award these punitive or exemplary damages. That would put him in a better position than he would have been in before the book was published. And it would put the publishing house and the author in a rather worse position than they would have been in. They're actually losing quite a lot of money, because if you remember, the punitive damages are just a deterrent. Now, the highest court in the land had made it quite clear in a previous case they weren't too keen on these punitive damages. Lord Devlin, one of the great law lords, had actually said in a case that he wished to narrow the amount of situations in which punitive damages could be awarded. But this is the really interesting part of Captain Broom's case. The Court of Appeal, when Captain Broom's case reached them, disagreed with this earlier decision of the House of Lords, the highest court in the land, and the court that sits above the Court of Appeal. The court said that they weren't going to follow the House of Lords decision. They were going to ignore orders from a superior officer, if you like, because they thought the House of Lords decision was wrong. Now I'll read out exactly what the Court of Appeal said. Lord Devlin threw over all that we knew about exemplary damages in his previous judgment. They said it was clearly wrong. They go on to say, it was not open to the House of Lords to ignore older cases restricting the compensation due to victims, and, quite insultingly, Lord Devlin must have overlooked them, or perhaps misunderstood them. That's quite an accusation to make about somebody who is in the highest court in England. The Court of Appeal said, Lord Devlin's new doctrine is hopelessly illogical and inconsistent, and any attempt to follow it is bound to lead to confusion. Lord Justice Salmon called it hopelessly indefensible and said the higher court's reasoning was, and I enjoy this one, like trying to suspend a 3-ton truck from a cobweb. Now the House of Lords would not let this attack on them go unchallenged. They sallied out, letting off an enormous volley of pretty lengthy speeches in response, telling off the Court of Appeal for not obeying their orders. When the judgment reached them, Lord Hailsham said the Court of Appeal took a somewhat unusual course, which he called unnecessary and plainly wrong, although actually he did agree with the Court of Appeal that the House of Lords had not been verbally inspired when they gave their previous judgment. He was surprised that the lower court was neither inhibited or embarrassed, and in spite of some of his own doubts about the previous House of Lords decision, he said we could only depart from it by tearing up the doctrine of precedent, which is fundamental to English law. Lord Reed and the other law lords joined in, calling the Court of Appeal judgment an aberration and a strange misconception. Finally, Lord Hailsham ended his speech with a damning telling off for the Court of Appeal, saying chaos would have reigned if they'd had their way, and in this country it is necessary for each lower tier to accept loyally the decisions of the higher tiers. Now, I actually once had lunch with a judge, don't ask me how this happened, who told me that if you disagree with somebody else, you say, with respect to so-and-so. If you strongly disagree with another judge, you say, with great respect to so-and-so. And if you think that so-and-so is an absolute blithering idiot, then you say, with the utmost respect for my learned brother so-and-so. And then you go on to completely trash what he's just said. But what do you notice about the comments that I've just read out from the Court of Appeal and the House of Lords? There was no respect whatsoever, not even a learned. The courts must have been seriously rattled by this encounter, firing off volleys at will, and in the Court of Appeal's case, in defiance of English precedent. In his book, David Irving accused Captain Broom of disobeying orders from the Admiralty. But it seems to me that the Court of Appeal decided to do a bit of swashbuckling themselves. Isn't that interesting? What started miles and miles away at sea and around 30 years before the case was heard in court led to a legal showdown, not just between the parties themselves, but between the judges. Now, you might be interested to know how it all ended. Well, Captain Broome won in the House of Lords, as he had done in the Court of Appeal and the lower court. He was awarded compensation by both courts, and he got both exemplary damages and the compensatory damages to put him back to how he was before the slander and libel had been committed. On the legal side of things, the House of Lords, as the highest court in the land, got their way. However, other Commonwealth jurisdictions such as Australia and New Zealand actually took an approach that was rather closer to the Court of Appeals when referring to exemplary or punitive damages. That means that English common law on the subject of libel is actually a little further away from other countries in the world than it was previously. So I guess let this case be a lesson to us all. Be very careful what you say.